The morning sun struck the glass towers of downtown like 1,000 blades of light, and none of it warmed Julian Cross as he stood on the marble steps of Global Truck Corp., clutching a cardboard box that held everything left of his career. 15 years of loyalty, ended in the time it took his boss's wife to point a manicured finger and scream that he was finished. He didn't fight back. He didn't even blink. He simply lowered his eyes, picked up the box the security guard had already packed for him, and walked toward the revolving doors, while dozens of co-workers who used to laugh at his jokes now stared at him like he was a stranger being escorted out of his own life. If you believe people deserve second chances, and that kindness always finds its way back to those who give it, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, share this story with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Heartbeat Tales so you never miss what happens next. Because what unfolds next on these very steps is going to remind you why some stories are worth staying for until the very last word. Julian hadn't asked for pity. He had only asked, 3 days earlier, for a Friday afternoon off so he could pick up his 8-year-old daughter Nora from her school assembly, where she was being recognized for an essay she wrote about her father being her hero. He'd asked politely, the way he always did, standing in the glass-walled office of Preston Ashworth, the young heir who had taken over daily operations from his father. Preston had barely looked up from his phone. He'd said something about deadlines, about commitment, about how heroes don't leave in the middle of a crisis. Julian had gone anyway. He would go again in a heartbeat. Some things mattered more than quarterly reports, and his daughter's face lighting up when she saw him in that auditorium was one of them. He hadn't expected to lose his job over it. He definitely hadn't expected Preston's wife, Vivian, to be the one who delivered the final blow, storming into the office that morning in her red dress and diamond earrings, furious that Julian's harmless absence had somehow delayed a shipment tied to a deal she'd bragged about at a dinner party. She didn't ask questions. She didn't want explanations. She wanted someone to blame, and Julian, quiet and unassuming, was an easy target. By the time Preston joined her on the steps, arms crossed, jaw tight with practiced authority, the decision had already been made. Julian was let go without severance, without a handshake, without so much as a proper goodbye to the team he had helped build from nothing. He walked down those marble steps that morning feeling smaller than he had ever felt in his life. Behind him, the glass doors reflected a version of himself he barely recognized, a 38-year-old man in a slightly wrinkled shirt, carrying a box of picture frames and a coffee mug that read, "World's Okayest Employee," a joke gift from his co-workers years ago that now felt like the cruelest kind of irony. Ahead of him, the city moved on as it always did, indifferent to the quiet collapse happening in the middle of the sidewalk. Julian's mind raced toward the only thing that mattered anymore. How was he going to explain this to Nora? Since his wife passed away 3 years earlier after a long illness, it had been just the two of them, learning how to survive the empty spaces in their apartment, the empty chair at dinner, the birthdays that would never again have her voice in the room. Julian had built his entire life around being enough for his daughter, around proving that one parent, if he tried hard enough, could still give a child a full and steady life. Losing this job didn't just threaten his finances. It threatened the fragile stability he had fought so hard to create. He was halfway down the steps when a low, powerful engine sound rolled through the plaza, silencing the murmuring crowd of employees who had gathered to watch the spectacle. A sleek, midnight blue Rolls-Royce, worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes, glided to a stop at the curb, its presence so commanding that even Preston straightened his posture instinctively, the way people do when they sense power greater than their own. A uniformed driver stepped out and opened the rear door with practiced grace, and from the car emerged an elegant older woman named Eleanor Voss, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, dressed simply but unmistakably someone who commanded rooms without raising her voice. Julian had no idea who she was. Neither did most of the crowd, though a few executives near the entrance went pale, whispering her name like it belonged to someone dangerous. Eleanor didn't glance at Preston. She didn't acknowledge Vivian's theatrical huff of impatience. Her eyes moved straight to Julian, standing there with his box, looking like a man trying to hold together the last pieces of his dignity. She asked him, in a voice both gentle and unshakably firm, if he was the man who had just been let go for leaving to see his daughter's school event. Julian, caught completely off guard, simply nodded, unsure whether to feel embarrassed or terrified. Eleanor turned toward Preston with the calm precision of someone who had spent decades in boardrooms deciding the fates of companies far larger than his. She reminded him, in front of everyone, that she was the majority shareholder who had quietly funded Global Truck Corp's expansion 5 years earlier, the very expansion Julian had personally overseen through 18-hour days and sacrifices no one in that building had ever bothered to notice. She said she had read every performance report that crossed her desk, and Julian's name had appeared in nearly all of them, always tied to solutions, never to problems. Preston's face drained of color as Eleanor asked him plainly whether firing the one employee responsible for the company's smoothest operations, over a matter as small as a school assembly, was truly the decision he wanted his name attached to when the quarterly board review came around. Vivian opened her mouth to protest, but Eleanor's gaze silenced her before a single word could escape. There are people in this world who don't need to raise their voice to command a room, and Eleanor was one of them. Julian stood frozen, his box still in his arms, listening to a woman he had never met defend him with more conviction than anyone in that building ever had. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about being seen, truly seen, for the first time in years by someone with the power to do something about it. Eleanor turned back to him and said something that would replay in his mind for the rest of his life, that a man who chooses his child over convenience is exactly the kind of man she wanted leading people, not following orders from those who couldn't tell the difference between loyalty and love. She offered him a position on the spot, not as an act of charity, but as an investment in someone whose character had just been tested publicly and had passed with more grace than most executives ever managed under pressure. She told him to bring Nora by the office sometime, that she wanted to meet the little girl brave enough to write an essay about her father being her hero, because clearly, she said, the world needed to hear more stories like that. Julian felt something crack open in his chest, not from sadness this time, but from a disbelief so overwhelming it nearly buckled his knees. He thought about all the nights he had lain awake wondering if he was failing his daughter, if trying his best was somehow not enough. In that single moment, standing on those steps with a box of picture frames still balanced against his hip, he understood that sometimes life doesn't reward the loudest or the most ruthless. Sometimes it rewards the ones who quietly keep showing up, who choose love over convenience, again and again, even when no one is watching. If this story touched your heart even a little, if it reminded you that kindness has a way of arriving exactly when you need it most, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who might need this reminder today. Your support means more than you know, and it's what allows stories like Julian's to keep reaching the people who need them. And before we close this chapter, if you felt something stir in your heart while watching, comment the word "grace" below, so I know this story truly reached you. Julian walked to that Rolls-Royce not as a man who had lost everything, but as a man whose quiet integrity had finally been recognized by someone with the power to change his story. Later that afternoon, when he picked Nora up from school, he lifted her into his arms and spun her around right there in the parking lot, laughing in a way he hadn't laughed in years. She asked him why he seemed so happy, and he simply told her that sometimes, when you do the right thing even when it costs you everything, the universe finds a way to give it all back, and so much more.